and a very warm welcome to all the people attending this fireside chat today on a very critical and a relevant topic of today's era, which is responsible AI, decode, contextualize, and operationalize. A session organized by Analytics India magazine in association with Tredence, a data science and AI engineering company focused on solving the last mile problems in analytics. As we all know, with AI adoption increasing across industries, there has been a massive emphasis on developing and deploying ethical, responsible AI applications. Being a positive force, responsible AI encompasses several aspects of making the right decisions when adopting artificial intelligence. A responsible AI framework focuses on bias detection, privacy, governance, and explainability to help organizations harness the true potential of artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, the practical implications of responsible AI are still unclear. Also, organizations trying to implement responsible AI have always been struggling with questions like, can this be applied across industries and domains? And if the organization is compliant enough to responsibly deploy artificial intelligence, which is responsible. To discuss these queries, we have an esteemed panelist, including Professor Balaraman Ravindran. He's the head of Robert Bosch Centre of Data Science and AI, and also a professor at IIT Madras. He's also the co-director of Reconfigurable and Intelligent Systems Engineering Group at IIT Madras. He has nearly 2 decades of research experience in machine learning and specifically in reinforcement learning. Along with him, we have Mr. Soumendra Mohanty. He's the Chief Strategy Officer and a Chief Innovation Officer at Tredence Inc, who has a career spanning over 25 years and led key growth portfolios with respect to industrial IoT, data analytics, AI, intelligent RPA, etc., and brought in world-class capabilities. Shom has also established a wide range of digital and data analytics capabilities and has been a key member of client-centric innovation culture to solve problems at the convergence of physical and digital. And thirdly, we have Dr. Aravind Chandramouli. He's the head of AI CoE at Tredence Inc, who has industry experience of over 15 years in NLP and machine learning space. Before Tredence, he has his career in Google, Microsoft, GE Research Labs, and Fidelity Investments. At Tredence, his team focuses on solving complex problems for clients using the right AI techniques. So these set of people would be the right people for us to know how to deploy responsible AI. These dignitaries will help us learn the best practices and techniques for driving responsible AI in our organizations. We'll also take up a few questions at the end of the session, so please drop in your queries at the Q&A tab. So without any further delay, we'd like to welcome you all to this fireside chat. Hi.
Hello.
So,
thank you.
So let's get into the questions. Before we actually understand the challenges and how we can deploy responsible AI, Shom, I would really like to understand from you, what is the motivation for responsible AI? Why responsible AI is important, according to you?
Thank you. First of all, warm welcome to all the attendees and the fellow panelists, Professor Ravindran and Aravind. Very happy to be on this forum and interacting with all of you. See, AI is all pervasive now, whether you're using your smartphone to order food or hailing a taxi like a Uber, or you are monitoring mission critical assets far away from your head offices. Yeah, it is all pervasive in that sense. And AI by nature is self-learning. It tries to understand the historical patterns and nuances and how you have used it to do certain things. It learns from there, and it tries to do the same thing with the same situation happening in a very autonomous way. And So there is a very thin line between a machine learning and doing stuff on its own, and with the newer situations, it keeps on learning, right? So there is a cognitive capabilities that slowly gets into it. And this is why responsible AI is very, very important. Few reasons behind it. One is, hypothetically, right? We have not seen that yet, but if it learns enough, will it replace the entire human cognitive capabilities, right? And if it does that, it is a serious concern. Um, it learns enough, it augments our capabilities to do things that we are not able to do today. That is something where we need to go, right? So that human will be now leaving aside the mundane, the repetitive stuff, and going into the higher order of work or type of task. And who designs these things is the human, right? Our chief data scientist like Aravind, professor who is involved in a lot of research, they design these kind of machines. And human by nature is very complicated. We have got our own preferences, biases, own way of looking at different things. Because we are designing these machines, we are also unknowingly seeding in our biases, preferences into the machine. And AI is always data hungry. We know for sure data by itself is dumb. We contextualize data to find meaning, and hence there is a bias in the data as well. The algorithm could have also biases and preferences, and certain tribal knowledge is seeping around it. All of this makes it a very potential and lethal problem statement. If it is not responsible, then we have a serious issue. So that is why it is very critical and very important.
Correct. Very rightly mentioned that AI keeps learning, and with human intervention, there is always a possibility to bring in that human biases into those AI applications or the implications that we are bringing in. Correct. So now that we understand that AI, what is responsible AI, Arvind, I'll come quickly to you, and if you can let the audience and me know, how do you define responsible AI? What is the definition of responsible AI?
Okay. So, Srishti, right? I mean, if you look at the definition of responsible AI, right, there is more than one thing that goes into it, right? I mean, it's a bunch of characteristics that go into it in terms of defining what responsible AI means. And there is a bunch of things. I'm going to limit myself to the top 5 here, right? What I think go into responsible AI. And I think the best way to illustrate that would be through an example. Right? I mean, all of us probably either have gone through this or are going to go through this, where we apply for loans, right? Personal loans, auto loans, home loans, right? 20 years ago, it was much simpler. I mean, we would go with our documents, we will probably provide a salary slip, collateral, and the loan officer would manually look at it and provide a recommendation, right? Now, banking industry, you have AI models that are predicting whether a loan should be approved or rejected. And assume that I'm applying for a home loan. I reside in Whitefield, Bangalore, right? Scenario 1, I apply for my home loan. Model rejects it, right? But I don't have any reasons given up, right? So this means the first concept for responsible AI comes in, which is the explainability that Shom was referring to, right? And Sujati, what you mentioned in the beginning as well, right? So we want models to be explainable, right? So great. We introduce explainability to the model. The next version comes in, right? Now the scenario is basically to say that again my home loan gets rejected, right? But I'm being told that the loan got rejected because of my, say, ethnicity, right? Now the model is explainable, right? But the model is highly biased now, right? I don't want my home loan to be rejected because of my ethnicity. So number 1, explainability. Number 2, you want this to be unbiased. You want your model to be unbiased, right? Okay, so we fix the bias problem. Then comes in scenario 3. Again, loan gets rejected, and the explanation that comes out of this is to say that you know what, 80% of the people in Whitefield did not repay loan, right? So your home loan is rejected, right? Again, this is explainable, probably unbiased, but still not justifiable, right? So that comes in the third aspect of responsible AI, where you want to be able to justify the model predictions, right? You want to say that model decisions, will I be able to justify it? As a human, if I look at it, would this be something that I can justify, right? The fourth, I mean, maybe once we fix these three, right? Maybe scenario 4 is all good, and I get my home loan rejected because of the reason that I failed to pay my EMI on my auto loan last year. Maybe I missed a couple of payments, and then I would understand, okay, it makes sense because I didn't pay a couple of EMIs for my auto loan, right? It makes sense that my home loan, probably if I take it, I won't do this, right? So this covers the first three aspects, right? But then what would be interesting is if there are fellow people who are going to, or other people who are going to apply for home loan in a similar situation, right? Are they, and if they miss a couple of EMIs, right? Is it going to be always the case that their home loan is also going to get rejected? So we bring in the aspect of reproducing, I mean the reproducibility, right? We want the model to be able to reproduce the results for similar instances. And this is not easy, right? Because the model does not take only one input. You're going to have more than, say, 1,000 inputs depending on the complexity of the model. Now reproducibility, even the definition becomes harder here. But one thing that humans will look for, let's say we spoke about governance, is to say that is there reproducibility, because otherwise the trust on the models is going to go down, right? The final thing is the fifth item that I want to, fifth characteristic that I want to talk about, right, is my personal favorite, which is the monitoring, right? The model monitoring. I think probably the recent T20 World Cup, all of you would have seen the ad on Finilex pipes from Sehwag, right, where he says, put it one time, forget about us, I mean forget our name for the rest of our lives, right? So when I work with client stakeholders, lot of times people confuse AI models with Finolex pipes, in the sense that they just say, deploy the model, I should not want to hear anything from you, right? Deploy the model, it should work smoothly for the rest of my organization's life. Unfortunately, models don't work that way, right? They need careful monitoring. We need to be able to make sure that the model is doing the right thing over time. Example, I'll extend the same example, right? 5 years down the line, I apply for my home loan. I don't want the model to look at my missed EMI payment 5 years ago and make the prediction or reject my loan in 2025, right? So here we want the model to have the latest data to train, right? We need to make sure that model has the right data to train. Again, drift. This is something we don't want the data to drift. So all in all, we want monitoring to be a key piece, right, when we deploy the model. So top 5, again, I'll just repeat it again. Explainability. We want the models to be unbiased. We want the model predictions to be justifiable, right? The top 3, then reproducibility, and 5th is monitoring. So all of these, right, go towards making sure that the AI deployment that we do is going to be responsible in nature.
Correct. Very nicely described, Aravind. And by the examples that you have set, you can understand. I mean, we all can understand that how important this responsible AI is. Whether it to bringing in our credit loans, or our home loans, or any sort of business that we are trying to build. So, thank you, Aravind. This actually brings me to my next point, Professor. I would need your understanding in this. It's a two-part question. Now that we know the importance of responsible AI and what is responsible AI, we would like to understand how can we use technology for making this responsible AI real. What are the current implications or implementations that we have in the industry? And my second part of this question would be, what are the open research areas that academia is currently working on with respect to responsible AI?
So thank you, Sujati, and welcome to the audience as well. And so before I answer your question, can I continue on Arvind's answer for a bit? Because
Yes.
I think there are a couple of important aspects of responsible AI which Arvind didn't touch on. So one is about privacy.
Definitely.
Right. So responsible AI is I mean, so the data that is exposed to the AI to learn, right, should come with its with its safeguards and we should make sure that the system doesn't use the data in ways that it is not intended to use. Right? And informed consent, right? All those black boxes, like the check boxes when we check for accepting all those apps that we install on our phones, right? Give tremendous power for companies over our data, because we are accepting a lot of conditions without even looking at it. So it becomes now, I mean, informed consent is a myth, right? Because most common people don't understand what AI can do, right? So when I give you consent to use my data, it's up to the companies now to make sure that they are responsible. Right? So that's one thing. And the second thing is, fixing liability. Right? So there should be something goes wrong with the system. I mean, as Aravind outlined all the things that can go wrong with the system, right? So if something goes wrong with the system, so who takes actual legal responsibility or whatever operational responsibility for what went wrong with the system, right? So that is something that's very important, and that also needs to be very much ingrained into a system on responsible AI. And of course, there are a whole bunch of other things like guarantees on security. I mean, can you be sure that the AI system that you're deploying is robust to attacks, right? Or if is there a way to monitor it so that you can recognize that it is under attack, right? And a bunch of things. So these are a couple of things which I thought I should mention, both the liability part as well as the privacy part, right? So making sure the data is kept. So coming to what is it that the industry is doing, right? In fact, surprisingly, given how much AI has spread out, right? So we heard examples about how AI is impacting everyday life, right? I mean, ordering food or navigating to a location. If this had been a physical meeting, I would have probably been using Google Maps to get to this, right? So every aspect of life is being impacted by AI. So what is the liability to Google Map if it gives you a wrong direction when you're trying to make it to an important meeting? Nothing, because you accepted that when you installed Google Maps, right? So I'm not picking on Google. It's just that everywhere, right? So you're getting recommendations. AI is actually being used in everyday life, but almost always it is in that space where if AI makes a mistake, right, it's not critical. Right? Except when Aravind doesn't get a home loan. But apart from that, so when AI makes mistakes, it's in places that are not critical. Okay, I missed a search query, or I didn't give you the right song when you asked for it. So it's okay, right? So we really don't have the technological pieces that we need to really roll out responsible AI as outlined by the principles of responsibility we set out, right? Explainability. Do we have robust explainability systems for AI, right? So you do, as long as you're sticking to simple linear models. As soon as you get into the more complex domains of modern deep learning and things like that, right? So there are very few things that are available. The second thing is about bias, right? Bias and unfairness. In fact, we don't even understand how this notion of bias even creeps into the system. We might think that you are balancing the data exceedingly well, right? So, for example, I mean, there were, no ethnicity information could have been entered into the data set, right? The data you might have completely removed the ethnicity information, but your address might be correlated to ethnicity. Because I mean, people of one race tend to live in one region, or and things like that, right? Or even in India, I mean, villages kind of indicate very strongly what your background is, right? So address the AI is clever enough to pick on those, right? And even though it might not tell you that I'm rejecting your loan because of your ethnicity, it might tell you I'm rejecting your loan because of where you live. And that might be a little confusing to people, but that's a source of bias, right? So it's in fact even recognize that there are these sources of bias. That's a lot of work that needs to be done, right? So the industry is making progress, right? So for example, the use of facial recognition technology is now being deprecated in the West, because they are kind of figuring out that, hey, look, facial recognition technology comes with so many loopholes, right? So you miss out on people who in the West, right? So African Americans, it's very hard to identify. So it frequently misclassifies them, and there are all these horror stories about a perfectly innocent man being picked up for a bank robbery or a store robbery because the AI misclassified the face, right? So in such cases, we have kind of the research is at a point is that we are at least able to understand where are the sources of unfairness coming from, even if we don't know how to mitigate them yet. Right? So what we are, at least the solution seems to be more in a policy manner. So hey, if you're not able to tell me that there is no unfairness here, then at least defer from applying it in these kind of critical law and order or legal setting. So again, there is this other case about this bail decision making AI, which has again now been discontinued. The use of which has been discontinued in the US because it was again very prejudicially was assigning low scores for black people. Right, African Americans were prone to were classified as being prone to be repeat offenders when in fact they were not. Right? So there are many cases like that where now people are starting to identify these kinds of sources of biases, and then at least being more cautious about rolling it out into certain kinds of applications. So that is one thing that is happening from the industry side of things. So parallelly in the academic domain, right? So people have started looking at how can I build systems that even when I remove these kinds of sensitive attributes, what are called sensitive attributes, right? How can I ensure that even in the absence of sensitive attributes, I'm not latching on to something that indirectly is conditioned on the sensitive attribute? Like I said, address. Right? I mean, address could be. In fact, there was this case in Bangalore, right? A guy who was working for a big multinational corporation repeatedly kept getting his loan rejected because he had given his parents' address, which happened to be in some village, and so even though his personal wealth was pretty good, right? He was basically latching on to that address and then rejecting his application, right? So those kinds of things. So can I make sure that these kind of even indirect associations don't happen, right? So this is people have actually formulated it in a very theoretically sound way, and they are looking at it. But then there is a gap between the theory and the practice, right? Getting where the rubber meets the road, right? We still have some distance to go. But what I'm really happy is that this conversation is happening, right? And this is something which is if the absence of the conversation is worrisome, right? So it shouldn't be that. We always say that what it would take is like one self-driving car to go crazy and ride on the pavement. Doesn't matter how many humans ride on the pavement and cause casualties. One self-driving car goes on the pavement and causes casualty. That will be the death knell for AI. At least we are not waiting for something like that to happen. We're not waiting for that to happen. We have started having this conversation. So I think that is a very promising step forward. And one last point on this, right? So this is not a question just for the technologists alone, right? I talked about policy, right? I talked about liability, right? And I talked about privacy, right? So there are a lot of things where you have to look at a much larger pool of people. You need social scientists, you need ethnographers, you need people with legal expertise, all of these people to come in before you start talking about how and what is the scope of responsible AI. Right? So if you look at the recent document put out by Niti Aayog, so they have talked about the role of the government and the role of the industry in deploying it responsible AI. And the document talks about like nearly 70% of the document is on the role of the government. 30% of the document is on the role of the industry. Because a lot of this, things that we're talking about responsible AI, so 30% comes from the technology people, but a lot needs to come from the policy and the government side. So that is this kind of conversations have to happen a lot more. So I'm thrilled to be part of this.
Correct. Actually, I also believe that these sort of conversation are the first step to bridge that gap between theory and practical that you have made. If we do not have these conversation, I am sure a lot of people will be unaware of the fact that there's a concept of responsible AI and AI can make mistakes. Also, like you have mentioned, in US and in other countries, there have been a lot of ban on these facial recognition technologies because of the
not a ban. Okay, people are voluntarily reducing it because they are afraid of the liability. Frankly, okay,
Correct.
it's not a ban yet. So you can still use
because of the implications it has created for a certain section of people. So so for these discussions are indeed important. So thank you, Professor. Arvind, I would like to bring this apart. And I would like to ask you this point is, what is the need for guiding principles for responsible AI, and what are those guiding principles? If you can list them down for us. Arvind, you are on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. Essentially, before I go there, right, just a couple of points about what Professor Ravindran mentioned, right? Before getting into guiding principles, I think that will be a nice point there as well, right? A lot of companies are coming up with their open source toolkits for responsible AI, right? I mean, there is offerings from Google Cloud, for example, on a responsible AI toolkit, right? Like Professor mentioned, right, the maturity is open to question, right? I mean, there is a lot aspect in terms of the commercial aspect, right, which is more we want something out in the market versus what it can practically do to address all the questions that we discussed so far, right? Is it really going to be something that is indeed going to make, so I use the toolkit, is it going to guarantee me but that the AI deployment that happens through this is going to be indeed responsible, right? I would say the answer is probably no right now, right? But there are offerings that is coming from different industries, like you mentioned, with I mean, different companies that are coming there, right? And this is where, right, it is important for the guiding principles, because everybody is coming up with their own version of what responsible AI means, right? So there needs to be like a standardized framework, right? A standardized framework that can be used. And responsible AI is in the very nascent stage, right? Just like what Professor was talking about just now, it is in a very nascent stage. And having these guiding principles, right, would hopefully provide us that consistent framework where we would be able to kind of say that, hey, if somebody claims that use this, there is going to be a responsible AI deployment happening, it is indeed happening, right? So the guiding principle is probably a right step in that direction. But having said that, again, you see guiding principles from different organizations, right? Google has its own set of guiding principles. Microsoft has their own set of guiding principles, and Niti Aayog, right, which Professor was referring to, they also have their own set of guiding principles. But I think the good news is that there is significant overlap amongst them, right? Significant overlap amongst all the guiding principles, and they are happily correlated with how we were talking about the definition of responsible AI, right? We say explainability, the guiding principle says transparency, right? You need to ensure that you are being transparent in your AI solution, right? That is needed to ensure that this is going to be I mean, this is going to be definitely a principle that you will need to implement, right? So that is definitely one, right? Transparency. Professor touched upon privacy, right? Privacy and security comes in. That is definitely a key part of the guiding principle, right? We talk about fairness, inclusiveness. Fairness and inclusiveness again goes back to what we were talking about repeatedly about bias, right? Which is a big challenge, right? So being able to talk about all of this, again, when we talk reproducibility, we talk about system stability. All these guiding principles again are a governing framework, right, that tells us that, hey, this is how you need to implement responsible AI.
Correct. You also mentioned that there has been an overlap of certain criteria and certain framework in all these guiding principles by various companies. I guess it is required, because end of the day we all required to produce AI which would be fair and ethical in terms of for all the people who are using, right?
Correct. Absolutely, Srishti. And see, there is, I mean, there is a responsible AI institute as well, right? Now we are talking about a responsible AI institute. We have different universities, right, which are setting up their own responsible AI centers. This is a big deal in the sense that this is something that companies want to invest in. They recognize that, hey, this is something that is extremely critical, right? It's not just enough that my models are being best in accuracy, right? It is important to make sure that our models are doing the right thing, right? Professor gave an example about how we are giving consensus for the data, right? My experience is that companies typically do the right thing, but is there a way for us to know it, right? Is there a way for us to know that they are indeed doing it, right? How do we make this provable, right? So the guiding principles, again, hopefully as they keep evolving, right, would help us define those frameworks there.
Correct. That's what was my next part. I wanted to understand also. I hope these guiding principles, Professor, I'm just gonna come to you. Just wanted to reiterate this point that these guiding principles need to evolve with time, considering we are, I mean, the AI is evolving with time. I believe these guiding principles should not be outdated, right? Okay, we sort of lost Arvind, but yes, Professor, please tell
No,
me.
so I was just going to say, what do you mean by do the right thing? Who defines what is right? I mean, so that is I mean, it's a lot more subtle than than what we are talking about now, right? So that is why you need this agreement. You need a centrally agreed upon principle. So I mean, having concurrence emerge organically is one thing, right? But if you look at it, the European Union is way ahead, right? And obviously, a
Mhm.
lot of the things which the European Union says, the company don't agree with because it's going to cost them money more than anything.
Correct.
So it's going to hit their bottom line. So there is a lot of protests against it. But then there is no question of pushback. The government has said that, the European Union has put in certain guidelines, and you have to follow it. I think there
Yeah.
should be, at some point, there should be a policy, that's a regulation framework that should come in for AI. I know that people in the industry don't like that word, but I think for safe, responsible AI, you need to have a regulatory framework. That's all I just wanted to add to that. So it's not
Yes.
clear what you mean by ethical, what you mean by fair, who defines what is correct, and things like that. So it's very.
No, absolutely. Just one point to what Professor you mentioned, right? Since you mentioned the European Union, right? See, they are talking about responsible research and innovation, right? Ideally, I mean, we talk about research and innovation, and what they have said, this is mandatory that when you do research and innovation, you need to have the prefix responsible, right? It is okay if our research and innovation slow down, right? But we need to make sure that anything that comes out of research and innovation on the AI side, we need a responsible layer around it as well. So you're right, Professor. European Union is way ahead in terms of defining those frameworks, making sure that these things, that what are those aspects. But I think the hard part is the metrics, right? How do we come up with a consensus that talk about what is the right thing?
Correct. We need that guiding principle to tell us what is the right thing. Otherwise, it becomes like a vague statement. Totally agree. So, Shom, you have been silent for quite some time. I would like to understand from you, knowing that now that Arvind and Professor has mentioned the implementation and how the research and how industries are taking in the responsible AI. What, according to you, or how do you foresee the future of responsible AI?
Look, I was very keenly listening to these two, brains doing a little bit of a powwow there, and all the right, pointers, coming out. Look, we are in a very progressive journey, right? 5 years back, the use cases on AI and the impact of AI, the implications of AI were different. Right now, it is very, very different, right? And more and more, you would see mission critical solutions coming out. Whether it is you're traveling, through the hyperloops at a very, very high speed, and there is AI behind it, versus you are getting into a very, very complex and delicate surgery in the hospitals, versus you are looking into certain agricultural aspects where you can change the way agriculture has been happening. So it is, as you see, the use cases are also emerging, and use cases are also progressively getting into very, very complex scenarios. And a little impact there by AI, the outcome is going to be 100x times magnified, because till now, the use cases we have dealt with, like Professor was saying, that I want to go from point A to point B, suggest me how do I get there faster, right? Or avoid a toll. When you go back and look at this initial suggestions that came out from AI, they never said that this is a toll road and this is not a toll road, and then all that, right? So it evolved from there. Initially, it was point A to B, the shortest way. Now it is point A to B with 5 multiple choices for you Tomorrow it will be something else. I don't know what that is going to be. So, but those use cases are not so mission critical in a sense, right? Because we have become now confident, the technology has evolved a lot, compute power has gone up probably 1,000 times. The abundance of data has gone up, right? And all of this, the algorithmic sophistication has tremendously improved, and like Professor is saying, a lot of research happening and will continue to happen. So we will get into progressively more mission critical, complex use cases. And I foresee, obviously, there the vision and the implementation, the boundaries and the metrics that have been talked about for those cases have to be much more better prepared. And like Professor was saying, who do you penalize, or whose mistake is it? How would you do something? I'll share a very funny example. With intelligent automation, where there is AI plays a larger role, what we have done now, our workforce mix has beginning to change. So we have got certain automation, intelligent AI-driven agents, and then we have got human, and they're working together, right? Now imagine 5 years from now where you will find the intelligent automation agents and AI everywhere in the workforce. So now it is a human and a machine jointly doing a task. So in today's scenario, if something goes wrong, your year-end appraisal, you are pulled up. Your manager gives you a really good, piece of advice and a bit of a penalties, right? And because it is you who is doing everything. Now with a more and more human AI kind of a mixed up workforce, and you are going to do a lot of those kind of work going forward. If something goes wrong, who are you going to pull up? The human would say, look, the AI did everything. I was just hitting the button to trigger or execute this process, right? The AI, if the AI is truly humanized in a sense, you ask it, hey, what went wrong? Well, I gave all the right recommendations. Perhaps this guy didn't like me, didn't understand what my recommendations are, they didn't follow. No, it's a very, very interesting situation. What do we do? So I think with the progressive nature of complexities and very, very mission critical use cases that we will continue to uptake in the coming years, with technology supporting it, becoming much more autonomous, the question of how do we balance this human and machine interactions, right, is where responsible AI will become much more centralized. And if we don't fix that, or we don't understand the implications and hence define policies or guardrails or measures around it, it will become very, very complicated.
A very nice point that you have picked up. If AI does a mistake, who will you penalize? This has been a core, discussion for a lot of companies and a lot of people who have been facing the issue of.
Conversely, right,
Yeah.
human and machine both doing a fabulous job, who would you reward?
Correct. It's either ways, definitely. So considering AI, so we have to build an responsible or an ethical AI that embraces the entire human machine interaction and build something that is not only accurate but also responsible in terms of bringing out those insights. So very rightly pointed out. So uh, Professor, now if an organization implements or tries to implement responsible AI, how do we measure if a responsible AI solution has indeed been implemented? How will we figure out? Also, what is the success criteria for the same?
Yeah, so that's, as you probably should know the answer based on all the discussion so far, right? So we don't yet have a good understanding of what are the metrics of responsible AI, right? And what are the measures of responsible AI? Right? There are some that are pretty, obvious, like there are protected attributes on which you should not be discriminating people on, for example, right? And then being able to give complete explanations for all your decisions. So for each one of these principles that we talk about, we can come up with definable metrics, right? But then how it actually translates to what happens on the ground is going to be very, very sector specific. What is a valid explanation for a self-driving car might not be necessarily a valid explanation for something that makes loan decisions. Right? So you might have to explain things at very different granularities. When you start thinking about whether I'm going to go and look at whether a company has actually complied with these regulations, right? Then I really need to ground it in use cases. I need to really ground it in what is it that the final application is, right? So we need to do a lot of work in order to come up with metrics for, in fact, when I do audit, right? I'm not going to do the same kind of audit for a company like Tredence and a bank, right? So somebody is going looking at some kind of an internal audit, right? So things are going to be different. So now now you have to start thinking of responsibility audits and what are the metrics that you're going to have for each of these verticals that are there, right? And there has to be some kind of the principles and other things that we talked about, right, or at a much higher level. When I start talking about actually checking things on the ground, I also need to ground these principles to the different verticals. And I think that is an exercise that has been started in some small ways in some disciplines, at least. For example, the banking industry, I think, is a little bit farther ahead than the others in terms of thinking about what would constitute this kind of responsibility. And the Niti Aayog, again, because I actually consult for the Niti, so I know a whole bunch of things that they are doing there. They have also started this exercise in collaboration with some legal firms and trying to identify, for certain verticals at least, how do these principles of responsible AI translate to the ground. So that work needs to happen. And once you have these kind of sector-specific metrics, right, then you can design audits around it. But until at the point that we evolve these metrics, it's going to be a little tricky and to determine whether the company is actually in compliance with these. Of course, there are very egregious violations like Cambridge Analytica, things like that, where things just blow up on your face. Those kinds of things which are very obviously not responsible usage of data. But more subtle cases, we still have to evolve these guidelines.
Correct. So, Professor, what you actually mean is that the metric to actually audit or understand the success criteria of responsible AI for an organization would depend on the industry or the domain that they are working on.
Sure.
Correct.
Like I give you an example, right? I mean, what constitutes an explanation for, race might not be a factor that enters at all into explanations in self-driving vehicles, right? So you may just need to know whether there is a passenger, there's not a passenger, and things like that.
Correct.
But then you could go into the financial domain or the legal domain, right? When talking about bail decision, then you have to, other factors come into play that are very, very different, and maybe the protected attributes are different. Right. So for me to come up with a verification checklist as to whether the system is responsible or not, I'll have to look at very, very different factors depending on the vertical.
Correct. But do you think that there could be some factors that are similar to all the domains?
That's what we are talking about in terms of this kind of principles of fairness, principles of responsible AI, right? So that is kind of lifting these factors to a higher level, so that you can talk about something that cuts across all of these. But when you start talking about metrics, right, there are some things maybe, right? So there's some things that are so critical that you can talk about it across at least several verticals, if not universally, right? But then you really need a scorecard that goes more into the nitty-gritties of how things are deployed. For example, how often do I? So Aravind was talking about monitoring a model, right? So how often do I need to monitor a model to be declared as responsible? So in some cases it might be order of milliseconds. Right? Some kind of security-related issues, right? Cyber security-related issues. The model might have to be monitored in order of seconds or milliseconds. And in other kinds of issues, it could be in the order of months, right? Because the data drift is very different. Right? So leaving it at a very generic level and saying that you apply it as you see fit to your industry is a recipe for disaster. when I want to do this kind of auditing, right? So when I want to have a regulatory agency that's going to look into these things, it's better to get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Otherwise, it's
True. Correct. Very, very nicely explained, Professor. Arvind, bringing this to, this brings me to my next point is what, according to you, is the adoption rate for responsible AI in this industry? If you have
Okay.
any views on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So I think the adoption rate, right? If you look at responsible AI as an overarching system, right, is negligible, right? I think negligible, abysmally low is what you would call out, right? But I think I need to qualify that statement, right, and say that if I break it down into pillars, right? Let's say, how are people doing on explainability, for example, right? Like Professor mentioned, there are no metrics, right? There are no metrics to measure, so there is no way to put that. There is no way to say that this qualifies as a responsible AI deployment right now. But as far as what are people trying out, right? If I were to kind of rank them, right, in terms of the different guiding principles that have been laid out, we'll definitely see explainability and monitoring, right? For example, being far ahead when compared to the rest of the metrics, right, or the rest of the characteristics that we spoke about. Explainability is something that people ask for. Explainability is something that is becoming more and more mainstream. But like Professor said, does it mean that explainability is being done the right way? Are we doing the explainability the right way? Are there metrics in place to do that, right? That is a harder question, right? Because explainability by itself is kind of, it's like saying that how do I grade the teacher, right? Explainability is trying to provide an explainability for the model. Right now we are talking about how do I now grade the teacher and say that is this explainability making sense? Are there better explainability models here? The second part about monitoring, right, is about the drift and everything. Again, we see more acceptance from clients, stakeholders in the industry, where they agree that monitoring is required. They see the pitfalls of not doing monitoring, right? And adoption rate, right, I think is also connected to the offerings out there, right? We have the cloud offerings where they bring in a more robust explainability when compared to the rest of the things that we discussed, right? Bias, privacy, ensuring privacy, bias, reproducibility, or justifiability, right? I don't even know how you create a metric for something that is being justified, right? A justification is a very abstract thing. How do we come up with an automated way to say that the model predictions are all justifiable? So I think cloud offerings are more mature for explainability monitoring. In fact, in Tredence, we are working on our MLWorks product, which has explainability monitoring, and ours is also pretty mature in those two when compared to, say, bias, inclusion, and so on, right? And there is also the learnings from the organization perspective, right? McKinsey recently had a survey where organizations actually mentioned that adoption of responsible AI is their #1 priority, right? They mentioned that this is the #1 priority for 2022, right? So the good news again, right, just like we spoke about having this conversation, is the recognition from the industry as well, right, that this is critical, this is absolutely needed. No longer can we go with saying that, hey, my model is highly accurate, 90%, we declare success and we move on, right? That is not sufficient. Making sure that in addition to that, all these responsible AI parameters, guardrails are needed as well, right? I think that is important, and I think the journey will be about figuring that out, figuring out in terms of how do we exactly make this real and continue to increase the adoption rate.
Correct.
Can I quickly add something to that? There's
Please.
one space where little bit more progress has been made in adoption is in privacy, about not using personally identifiable information and all that, because the regulations are in place for it already. Therefore, the adoption in the industry is also kept pace. That's that. Just wanted to make it.
Correct. Very, very rightly pointed out, Professor. So this actually sort of brings me to the end of this chat. So I would really like to understand firstly from Shom, if you want to, after listening to this entire discussion, if you want to put responsible AI in one word for the coming decade, what will that be?
In my view, that one word will be humanize AI. I think of course, it has got a lot of nuances, lot of connotations of what humanizing means, but it cannot be a black box anymore. It has to be open, it has to be interactive, it has to be inclusive, and also, we should have the trust, and trust is a very big thing for a human, right? So that's why I'm kind of, you asked one word, but very difficult to put it in one word, and hence I'm saying it has to be a humanizing.
Let's make it a phrase.
Yeah. So it has to be trustworthy. It has to be, transparent, like Aravind was talking about, and it should be, scaling to take the human inclusion in this entire ecosystem, right? If human is not in the loop, then it's a big problem. We cannot just have it autonomous in a sense that it is just working behind the scene and then just doing stuff. Yeah, those would be my preferred choices.
Very nicely mentioned. Arvind, what do you think? How would you put responsible AI in one word or a phrase for the coming decade?
I think mandatory, right? Mandatory would be the one word, right? I think over the next decade, right? I believe that just like what we report, right? I mean, we never say, hey, the model worked, right? We speak about accuracy, we bring in those metrics, we show precision, we show recall, right? Similarly, what we will bring is a responsibility score, right? I mean, we will say that along with this, you need to present this before the model can be deployed. Just like we start putting in SLAs, saying that above 80% precision is how the model goes into deployment, there would be a standardized score that says if your responsibility score for this AI solution that you have built is below, say, 90, there is no way you will be allowed to deploy this, right? So that would give confidence to people that I can trust the decisions, right? I think the whole of these, I mean, everything that we are talking about comes back to saying that, hey, how can I trust the AI solution, right? And the other factors about the implications also come in. So I think mandatory is the keyword, along with saying that we will need these. I mean, we would make it mandatory. It's going to be mandatory that you bring along your responsibility score along with your model accuracies.
Correct. So trustworthy and mandatory. These are the two words I have received so far. Professor, what is your stance on it?
I was going to say something similar to what Aravind said, right? So I was going to say that it should come to a point where you talk about AI systems that are deployable, right? So deployable AI should imply responsible AI. So you should not think of deploying systems that are not responsible yet.
Yeah.
Right? So I would say if you were asking me for one word, I would say a deployable AI system is responsible. Right. So that
Correct.
would mean, I mean, that kind of rolls in the mandatory aspect of it as well. Right. So I think we should come to a point where the thought process says that, hey, look, if I'm going to put an AI system into practice, it's not enough that it has this much accuracy, but it has to satisfy all the other. I mean, there are also societal impacts which we never really talked about. I mean, Som touched upon it a little bit about displacement of work and future of work and things like that. So all of these things have to be taken into account. And so that's basically deployable AI.
Correct. It's actually gone are those days where accuracy is the key point of having an AI implementation.
They have not gone. No, they have not gone anywhere. You still need your accuracy. Don't get us wrong.
No, but definitely responsible. Like you mentioned, if you are deploying AI, it should be a responsible AI. So on that note, I think we have come to an end of this discussion, but we have many questions that our audience has shared with us. So we would quickly like to go through a few of them in the interest of time. So I'll read them out for you if that works, and we can probably decide who would be the right person to, give us this explanation. So Reena is asking, there's a huge disconnect with the implementation of AI tools and penetration of AI understanding. It is whose responsibility to bring up that awareness so that people can relate with the outputs of AI models?
Let me take that. And this is what I was touching upon in the beginning of my commentary as well. Look, with the tools and technologies and all the advancements that we have done over the last several years, and will continue to do that, developing a AI solution has become much, much more easier compared to 10 years back or 15 years back. Yeah. And these are all very drag and drop, and then you bring your data, and then here is this powerful algorithm, here is a machine which has got abundance of compute power, and hence you put it on, it will torture the data to death, and then there is something going to come out, and then, hey, my output is ready now. Yeah. I think this methodology of doing it is going to be significantly challenged when you associate that with this responsibility score, what and Aravind was talking about and what Professor was talking about. There you have to go backwards. You have to start explaining why it did what it did. And hence, Reena, I must appreciate very, very important point that you have brought up, that it is not just about how I'm going to develop the model, which algorithm I'm going to choose, what kind of data I'm bringing in, and what is the output that I'm going to get out of this model, but it is also about what is the process through which I went through, and then at every stage, what is it is doing, and the implications of that, and hence relating back to an overall responsible AI kind of scoring method. There is a gap today, but I think with academia, with companies and industries, that understanding needs to come together, and it needs to evolve. It has to be mandatory to look at both the sides, don't just develop, but also look into what you're developing, why you're developing, how it is getting developed, and what is the impact of that development.
Correct. Correct. I hope that answers Reena's question. I have a very interesting statement shared by Madhumati. It's not a question, but it might bring up some discussion around here. She has written, when there is a bias in real life, why is it wrong for an AI model to predict with bias? Isn't what we sow is what we reap?
Well, we are creating something. Wouldn't we want it to be better than us? Don't you want your children to be better than you? You want them to make the same mistakes you made? Anyway, so let's not talk about that level of personification of AI. Let's getting back to more practical issues, right? So when a human being is, biased, right? It's an individual who is being biased. When I build an AI that is being biased, I'm making the bias more systematic. And when the AI is rolled out, right, it's some sense I'm validating the bias by deploying a system that I know is biased. And when I take in a human being, I'm not evaluating them for bias. And when I hire you, right, as a bank accountant or whatever, right? I'm not talking about, okay, maybe people do this when they select juries in the Western system, but at least here, when we do hire people for jobs, you don't test them for bias or anything, right? There are individual biases and everyone goes in their own direction. But once you start putting in an AI which is biased, right, built out of data bought from some set of people, it gets institutionalized, it gets amplified. Right, instead of being one person sitting in a bank and making biased decisions, you have this AI sitting through the entire banking system and making decisions for you. That is dangerous. Right, so this institutional sanction is what we don't want to give, and that is why we are putting this higher bar for AI. But I used to be one of these people who used to argue earlier that, hey, why do you hold AI to higher ethical standards than humans? That is because AI is a machine, and we are trying to think that machines are unbiased. So if AI is making a decision, then we try to think that a machine decision is unbiased. And B is this institutionalization, this amplification factor of AI. So
just one point I want to add to the amazing answer that Professor gave here, right? So is the Amazon AI recruiting tool, right? The fiasco that happened with the Amazon AI recruiting tool in 2018. Now they were biased towards male employees, right? I mean, they were selecting, the resumes selected were more of male employees, which was actually showing the general population distribution of Amazon, which had more male than females, right? But imagine the example that Professor gave, right? Instead of that, I mean, the hiring tool now makes it systematic, right? It is now discriminating every single time that happens. But I mean, I'm pretty sure that most of the hiring managers or the recruiters in Amazon were not doing that, right? It just so happened there was maybe an implicit bias, right? We might not know the real reason there, but maybe there was an implicit bias, but they were probably not going out of their way to select.
Arvind, I think that you're stepping into dangerous territory here. So.
So that's definitely rightly pointed out, and that's just one of the implications that we can have if we do not have a responsible AI. I'm sure it would have much more serious challenges that an entire community or people would be facing on a daily basis if we do not have an ethical AI. So yes. Okay, we have another question. This states the hype of deepfakes seems to have been in the moment. It's not the problem of AI behind the deeper ethical nature of how we view law and order. AI can be formulated on paper, in code. A law ruling can be done in the same way. But when it comes to automating law and order, ensuring the code runs in the likeliness to how we view ethics, this seems the real challenge. I'm not sure if this is correct, but it is a transformation to automating and how we undertake law and order with the medium being data.
Professor, would you like to take a crack at it?
No, I didn't understand most of the question. So if you understood the question, please go for it.
Go ahead. I mean, the way I understood this, right, was that the problem is not how we write the code. The problem is in way of basically making sure that, I mean, law and order, meaning the metrics that we were talking about, right? Making sure those metrics are in place and being able to do that in an automated fashion, ensuring that those guardrails are there. Would that be a right or an approximate translation of what you mentioned, Sujati?
Yes, that's exactly what is being mentioned and asked.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very hard problem, right? I think of all the things that we discussed, to me, in my mind, that is probably the hardest problem, right? To say that, I mean, how do we come up with those metrics consistently that talk about in an automated fashion, right? I mean, the simplest example, if we take software engineering, we talk about code coverage, right? I mean, that now seems like a simple problem. 20 years ago, we were thinking, breaking our brains about how to make sure that we understand the code that we are writing, how can we ensure that there is code quality and so on. So I think similarly this will evolve, and I think that is where all the research comes in, that we will break new barriers, right? But right now, yes, definitely a very, very hard problem.
I would agree. And I think Professor explained that also, that earlier, that look, the peculiarity of AI is it is still narrow. It does that narrow thing really, really well. It will do only one thing, and it will do it really, really well, provided you have gotten the right data, you have gotten the right algorithms and all. It is still a narrow intelligence, right? It cannot generalize for every single thing adjacent to that particular use case or situation is. I mean, we are far away from that super intelligence which human brain does. So when this thing comes as it's a very narrow intelligence, but very deep in that area, and autonomous, and can do, never gets tired of, it can run for 24/7 for every single time. This peculiarity makes it difficult for this automated aspect of metrics, because millions of such instances or use cases one need to go through, think through, prepare that kind of a framework so that it can be taken care of, right? There can be fraud detection, could be one example, but the adjacent to that will be, am I going to bump up somebody's credit line or low down credit line? These are adjacent cases, but these are very, very narrow, very focused in that area only. They cannot be generalized, right? So I think, just like code coverage example, we need to have something, but maybe that's a good area for research and innovation to think through. Yeah, but it's a hard problem.
Indeed, it is. Okay, in the interest of time, we will take one more question and then we'll wrap up the session. Sriram Ramachandran is asking how to correct models after they are productionized. Which mitigation techniques can be used? If you guys can explain a bit.
Yeah, Aravind, your space.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, so there are different ways in we do that, right? I mean, so the first thing is understanding, right? The first thing comes in to say that can we understand there is a problem, right? The recognition of the problem is always the first step there. So we need guardrails and metrics in place that tells us or measures that says that, hey, are things going fine, right? So that would be the first step, right? Once we do that, right? I mean, again, we want to automate as much as possible, right? When we talk large scale deployments and other things, I mean, we need to automate everything, right? So first understanding the problem, then understanding the severity of the problem, right? Both of these, right, are important. See, a lot of times, for example, we spoke about data drift, right? The data drift can happen, but the models can still perform, right? The robustness might be there where the model is still performing well. So we would want to take a step when we understand the implications, when we understand the severity of it. Professor also spoke about, hey, how often do we refresh, right? What is that interval which might be applicable for some applications, might not be applicable for other. So being able to customize that, the time interval, that's saying that when should we step in, when do we not step in, right? And to me, one of the challenges that I see when we talk about, let's say, a model retraining coming in, right, is how do we automate this entire process, right? From the fact that we want new data to come in, ensure that the new data, in fact, is actually a representative of all the new production data that is coming in. How do we ensure that the model retraining happens seamlessly without any intervention? So being able to set all these metrics, these SLAs, a whole bunch of things that goes in, right, where we talk about having different metrics set up and then have this run end to end as a seamless process. I think there is no single answer to say that, hey, we do this in 1 month's time, we do this in 3 months, right? It would depend on a lot of these parameters, but to me, the key answer, right, like you said, mitigation techniques can be something about retraining the model. Sometimes don't do anything, right? Sometimes it might be that, hey, the problem is not severe, you might actually tamper with something and break what is actually working fine, right? Because you might be trying to preempt something that might really not be a problem later. So there is a bunch of things there, but I think the key point is basically to say that how do we automate this entire process? So I think that is the challenge, and how do we automate, I mean, different aspects, covering the different aspects.
Correct. I hope that answers the questions. Unfortunately, we are a little out of time, but there's so many questions. So please write to any one of us, and we would be happy to take those questions. But for now, we will wrap up this session. Thank you so much, Shom, Professor, and Aravind, for participating in this fireside chat. It was pleasure listening to you and your thoughts, and I hope this helps. This session helps people who are attending, learn the best practices and techniques for driving responsible AI in their organizations. So thank you once again. Thanks, Shom. Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Aravind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.